What if I told you that the so-called discovery of the Philippines 500 years ago back in 1521 was not really the first time that Europeans met our ancestors? So, does this mean that Ferdinand Magellan lied about the Philippines? Did they lie about our people, our islands? Did they already know that our archipelago existed years before their historic expedition? Let's learn more. Wait lang, if you would like to watch this video in Tagalog, check out the links up here or down below for the Tagalog version of this video. Now back to our topic. Mabuhay or in Kapampangan, luwid kayo! Welcome back to a new video. It's me, Kirby, your friendly Pinoy historian. And if you are new to my channel, in this channel, I make videos about our people's history, our people's culture, and everything in between. So don't forget to like, share this video, comment down below, and subscribe. So this year, March 16, 2021, marked the 500 years since the so-called discovery of the Philippines, when the Spanish expedition led by the Portuguese Ferdinand Magellan sighted the islands of the Visayas back in 1521. So for today's video, let's explore the question, did Magellan lie about the Philippines? Now, to be fair, Ferdinand Magellan was actually a great sailor. He was an expert explorer from Portugal who eventually led an expedition for Portugal's own rival, the King of Spain. And this historic expedition was not just about the so-called discovery of the Philippines. It was also about the first successful sailing around the world, the first recorded circumnavigation of the earth, in which it was proven that the world was indeed round, that our planet was a globe and not flat. It also proved that one can successfully sail from Europe westwards across the Atlantic, around the Americas, and across the Pacific Ocean to reach the heart of the global spice trade, the islands of Southeast Asia. And this historic landing of Magellan's expedition in the Visayas is considered to be the first recorded Europeans to set foot in what we now call the Philippines. But in contradiction to how the pre-colonial Visayans have been depicted in the mainstream narrative, from paintings to school textbooks, our ancestors were not savages. They were not barbaric nor ignorant. In fact, when the Europeans reached the Philippines, they were already malnourished. They were dying of hunger and dehydration. They had already run out of supplies and provisions for several months while in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. And so when the pre-colonial people of the Visayas saw the desperation from the Europeans, they immediately welcomed them with open arms. They were quick to show generosity in the spirit of humanity. They fed them and provided them with much needed shelter and supplies to survive. And if not for the kindness of the Visayans, then perhaps many of the Europeans would have died in the middle of the sea. If the Visayans did not provide food nor shelter, then perhaps the historic circumnavigation of the world would have not been completed. It would have ended tragically halfway around the world. And it is also worth noting that Magellan was actually a better sailor, a better explorer than the more famous or infamous Christopher Columbus. Unlike Columbus, Magellan knew where he was going, and he was good at what he was doing. So how exactly did Magellan become good at this? How did he know where he was going? Unknown to many around the world, 1521 was not the first time that Magellan was in Southeast Asia. Because 10 years before, in the year 1511, when the Portuguese invaded the Sultanate of Malacca, a decade before the Battle of Mactan between Magellan and Lapu-Lapu's forces, Magellan was already among the soldiers and sailors that Portugal sent to Southeast Asia. In fact, it was in Malacca where he met his young slave, known to us today as Enrique de Malacca. And as mentioned in my older videos, Enrique de Malacca was an important figure in Magellan's expedition. He became the bridge between the Europeans and our Visayan ancestors in 1521. And according to many, Enrique should actually be considered and be recognized as the first person to successfully sail around the world, because Enrique came from Southeast Asia and he was was able to sail around the world and back to Southeast Asia a year before the Magellan Elcano expedition was able to return to Spain. So let's travel back to Malacca in the year 1511. Malacca during this time was among the world's most important centers of international trade. Malacca was a powerful and prosperous sultanate that European kingdoms had long wanted to acquire or at least get access to. This was because Malacca was at the heart of the most coveted and the wealthiest industry, the global spice trade. And so in 1511, the Portuguese launched an invasion and successfully conquered the Sultanate of Malacca. But unknown to most people, especially in the Philippines, the Luzones warriors from Luzon were among the vital allies of the Portuguese. The Luzones were the ancestors of today's Kapampangan and Tagalog people of the Philippines. But wait, before you accuse the Luzones of being traitors by siding with the Europeans, by siding with the Portuguese against the Sultanate of Malacca, it is important for us to understand that the world of geopolitics of this time was far different from our understanding of our modern day nation states. It was simply a different world, a different reality than what we are familiar with today. Actually, during this time, the Sultan of Malacca was also very controversial. He was at the center of conspiracies and behind countless crises, including the brutal murder of Malacca's own prime minister and his entire clan. The Sultan himself was blamed for the internal conflict in the Sultanate that led to the fall of Malacca into the hands of the Portuguese. It is also important for us to know and remember that apart from siding with the Portuguese, the Luzones were also among the Pan-Southeast Asian alliance that made numerous attempts to retake and reclaim the Sultanate of Malacca from the Europeans. During this time, the warriors of Luzon were said to be the most valiant and warlike people in this part of the world. But let's talk about this in future videos, about the Luzones warriors that exhibited valor in countless wars in Southeast Asia. For now, let's go back to Malacca's fall in 1511. After the Sultanate fell to the Portuguese appointed Regimo Diraja as Temengong. A Temengong is both a military rank and a political position. It is similar to the governor generals that we are familiar with today. But hold on, who was this Regimo Diraja and what does he have to do with our ancestors? Regimo Diraja was a native of Luzon. He was among the Luzones, a very wealthy merchant back in the early 1500s. He was a very popular international business tycoon who was also a highly skilled public administrator and politician. He was said to be the leader of the Luzones community in Malacca of the 1500s. And the Luzones in Malacca were not just a small community of migrants and merchants. The Luzones were among the largest migrant communities and among the most important merchants in the Sultanate of Malacca. Long before the Europeans reached Southeast Asia, our ancestors already had deeper relations and connections in Malacca and across East and Southeast Asia. From places like Sumatra and Thailand, from Cambodia to Moluccas, from Java to Japan, and many more. And thus, when the Portuguese invaded Malacca in 1511, the Luzones were among the significant Asian forces that they needed and sought to be in alliance with. The Portuguese forces in Southeast Asia during this time were not that big, so it was important for them to seek alliances with other Asians. And the Portuguese indeed took advantage of the internal conflict that has been brewing within the Sultanate of Malacca. So wait, what's the connection? What does it have to do with the discovery of the Philippines? It was in Malacca back in 1511 when Magellan learned a lot about Southeast Asia. Magellan's experiences during and after the conquest of Malacca really informed his path forward. Over a decade before he first sighted the islands of the Visayas, Magellan already had big ambitions to reach the Moluccas, also known as the Spice Islands. In fact, his own cousin, his best friend and mentor, Francisco Serrão, became a personal advisor to the Sultan of Ternate. The Sultanate of Ternate was one of the two sultanates that dominated the islands of the Moluccas. It is also important to note that according to both history and oral traditions, the royal family of Ternate in the Moluccas were closely related by blood and by marriage with the royal families of Luzon. And Francisco Serrão had long been trying to convince his younger cousin, Magellan, to sail and move to the Moluccas to join him in enjoying the prosperity and the good life in the Spice Islands. The Moluccas was the sought-after source of the world's most coveted and most expensive spices. It was the most important global trade for centuries, a sought-after trade that led to the colonial conquest of Asia and Africa and the so-called discovery and conquest of the Americas. And at the heart of this flourishing global trade was Southeast Asia, particularly the Sultanate of Malacca, where Magellan himself stayed and lived for several years, and where the ancient Luzones were also thriving in both the battlefield and in the Sea of Commerce. In fact, Regimo Diraja was not the only Diraja from Luzon who was thriving and was famous in the Straits of Malacca. Another famous and significant one was Surya Diraja. Surya Diraja was also a very wealthy international business tycoon, and he was a diplomat who was instrumental in bringing the Portuguese to China. He provided the Portuguese with a massive fleet. He was also an important bridge in the early diplomacy between Portugal and China. It is also believed that the Luzones were also instrumental in the first known contact between the Japanese and the Europeans. This list of famous Luzones Diraja also included the military genius Sapetu Diraja. Sapetu Diraja was entrusted and appointed as commander of a multinational army composed of warriors not just from Luzon and Southeast Asia but also from the modern-day countries of India, Turkey, and Ethiopia. They were given the important task of controlling the kingdom of Aru of northern Sumatra in the mighty Sultanate of Aceh in what is now Indonesia. And for those who are wondering, the word Diraja means royal. It is used in the many societies and languages of Southeast Asia to refer to people with royal blood. It is also what we call the Mapyang Sugi in the indigenous Kapampangan society. The Luzones were instrumental in both the economy and the politics of Asia. Way before the discovery of the Philippines, our ancestors were already thriving as merchants, diplomats, public leaders, and warriors connecting the many kingdoms across Asia. So, there are reasons to believe that Magellan almost certainly met the Luzones while he was in Malacca, that he might have learned about Luzon a decade before he met the Visayans, especially since the Luzones were among the important allies of the Portuguese in Malacca and Southeast Asia back in 1511. Magellan himself had a curious mind. He was, after all, an accomplished explorer and a restless conquistador. So it wouldn't be surprising or too far-fetched that he might have met the Luzones a decade before he landed in the Visayas, especially since, for example, the Portuguese apothecary Tomé Pires was able to learn more and write quite a lot about the Luzones in the early 1500s. So it was not impossible for Magellan's curious mind to learn about the Luzones and the island of Luzon a decade before the so-called discovery of the Philippines. And within just a few months after Magellan's own death in the Battle of Mactan in 1521, the remaining survivors of his expedition encountered the armada of the Sultanate of Brunei. And this armada of over 200 ships was led by the young Prince of Luzon, who was also the Laksamana or the admiral of his grandfather, the mighty Sultan Bolkiah of Brunei. This young Prince of Luzon is more familiar with us today as the Raja Matanda of Maynila. And among Raja Matanda's crew back in 1521 was the former slave that the Raja himself granted freedom, a pilot by the name of Pazeculan. Pazeculan is said to be from the port city of Makassar in what is now Indonesia, and he was a brilliant navigator who was also skilled in speaking Spanish. In fact, because he can speak Spanish, Raja Matanda gave Pazeculan the task to guide the Magellan Elcano expedition in navigating the waters of Southeast Asia from the Sulu Sea to Borneo on their way to Moluccas, so that the Europeans would not get lost on their voyage back to Europe. And if you haven't seen it yet, my video about this historic yet often untold encounter between the Europeans and my own ancestor, the young Prince of Luzon, the Raja Matanda of Maynila, check out the links up here or down below for that video and for more playlists about the untold histories of our own ancestors. For now, let's go back to Pazeculan, Magellan, and the Luzones. Pazeculan's ability to speak Spanish on top of the prominent roles of the Luzones in Malacca and Southeast Asia, these are just a few mind-blowing evidence that the Europeans had already met our ancestors long before the so-called discovery of our islands in 1521. In fact, the Portuguese Tomé Pires had already written about the Luzones in his accounts, Suma Oriental, which was written while he was in Southeast Asia between the years 1512 and 1515, years before Magellan's expedition even left Spain. But of course, further research is still needed. We still have to dig deeper and uncover a lot more evidence to relearn the untold histories about our people, to truly learn more and get to know our ancestors before the age of colonialism. So what if Magellan lied? Well, as of today, we really can't tell 100% sure yet whether or not Magellan lied, whether or not he knew about the islands we now call the Philippines. But regardless of the answer, it is important for us to be reminded that for many centuries, for hundreds of years, we have been taught that the history of our archipelago only began when Magellan discovered our islands in 1521, or that our ancestors were primitive, ignorant savages before the historic encounter in 1521. But of course, this is far from reality, very far from the true history of our diverse but interconnected people. Long before Spain and Portugal even became kingdoms, our ancestors were already thriving throughout Asia. Long before Europeans began their expeditions, our ancestors were already expert navigators, sailing across the different parts of the world, from the Pacific Ocean to the Indian Ocean. Ocean. So it is very important to learn and remember that the people of what is now the Philippines do not owe our civilizations nor our rich culture to Spain or Europe, because whether or not they discovered our islands, whether or not they ended up on our shores, our ancestors already had our own prosperous and thriving civilizations, complex societies, deeper histories, and colorful interwoven cultures. And just a reminder, this video is just a short introduction about the forgotten events surrounding the discovery of the Philippines. So keep an eye out for my upcoming book, Know Our Roots number 3, What They Never Told You About the Discovery of the Philippines. And just in case you missed it, my new book, Know Our Roots number 1, about Tondo, slavery, and the revolt of the Lacans, and my new coloring book, Color Our Roots number 1, about the ancient Luzones, are now available online. So check out the links below and order your copies today. And before I go, today's shoutout goes to Aris Wirianta from Indonesia, Lina Mike from Malaysia, Vladimir Orleans from East Timor, and Patrick Lucas Academia from the Philippines. And of course, special shoutout to my own good friend, Andy Vietnam from Vietnam. Maraming salamat, terima kasih, obrigado, kaman, dakal pong salamat. Thank you for all your love and support. And that is it for me today. If you liked this video or learned a thing or two, don't forget to like, share this video, comment down below, and subscribe. And special thanks to all my patrons for all your support in helping me make more videos like this. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, show your support and please be my patron or get a copy of any of my books or coloring books or any of the merch link down below. Maraming salamat po. Dakal pong salamat. See you next time, or in Tagalog, kita kits, and in Kapampangan, Mikitix!